In Maine, the rich man stayed as the designer woman worked late without explaining. The light in the workshop should have been off. Most places along the Maine coast went dark early, especially in late fall, when the wind came in colder and the days folded themselves shut by 6. The harbor quieted. The diner stacked chairs. The road thinned to the occasional pair of headlights cutting through mist. But the light was still on. From the street, it looked like a mistake. A single rectangle of warm yellow behind a fogged window, standing out against weathered wood and peeling paint. Anyone passing would notice it. And someone did. A woman walking her dog slowed. She looked twice. The dog tugged forward, nails clicking on damp pavement, but she lingered just long enough to register the scene inside. Iris Calder was still at the table. She stood with her sleeves rolled past her elbows, shoulders slightly forward, hands moving in small, precise motions. Fabric was spread across the work surface, weighted down at the corners with metal shears and a chipped mug. The sewing machine sat idle. This was handwork now. Slow work. The woman outside could not hear anything, only see the rhythm of it. Needle in, pull through, pause, adjust, again, and then she saw the man. Caleb Rowan was not inside the workshop. He stood just beyond the door, under the shallow awning, where the salt air had bleached the wood a dull gray. He had his hands in the pockets of his coat, not pacing, not checking a phone, just standing there, angled slightly toward the window. Watching was not quite the right word. He was facing the light, but his eyes were not fixed in any obvious way. If someone asked later what he was doing, it would be hard to say, waiting maybe, or simply not leaving. The woman with the dog frowned, not in suspicion, but curiosity. People notice things like that in small towns. A man who stayed. A light that did not go out. Inside, Iris did not look up. Her focus stayed on the seam. The thread was dark against pale fabric, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. She pulled it taut, tested the line with her thumb, then undid 3 stitches without any visible reaction. No sai, no pause to stretch, just back and forward correcting. By hand. The clock on the wall read 9:27. It had read 9:27 the last time she checked, too. The second hand moved, but the rest of the room felt suspended. The air held the faint smell of steam from earlier. Cotton warmed and cooled again, mixed with salt that crept in through the cracks no matter how often the windows were sealed. Caleb shifted his weight once. The porch board creaked under his boot. He stopped moving after that. He did not knock. He did not ask if she needed help, or if she was done, or why she was still working when everyone else had gone home. He did not step inside to fill the space with conversation. He stayed where he was, half in shadow, half in light. From the street, it could have looked like something else. A disagreement. A confrontation waiting to happen. That was how the woman with the dog read it at first. She slowed again, longer this time, her eyes moving between the man and the woman, the glass between them. Then she noticed what was missing. No tension in his posture. No impatience. No signal meant to interrupt. He was not there to be seen. He was there because he had not left. Iris finished the seam and held it up to the light, turning the fabric just enough to catch the yellow glow. She frowned, not sharply, but with concentration, then reached for the scissors again. Outside, the wind lifted and dropped, carrying the sound of water moving against the dock. A gull cried somewhere farther down the harbor. The woman with the dog finally moved on. The light stayed on, and the man did not go anywhere. Morning arrived without ceremony. In this town, it usually did. The light came in low and flat, filtered through a sky that never fully decided what it wanted to be. Gray leaning toward blue. Blue leaning back to gray. The ocean held the color quietly, a steel surface moving in steady lines, never rushing, never stopping. Along the coast, houses sat the way they always had, with siding worn thin by salt. Paint softened, not chipped, as if the weather had learned patience. Windows faced the water whether the people inside looked out or not. The road curved with the shoreline, not straightening itself for convenience. It dipped and rose, where the land told it to. A pickup truck passed, tires hissing against damp pavement, then nothing for a while. Iris Calder unlocked her workshop just after 7. The key resisted for a moment, then turned. The door opened with the same sound it made every morning, a familiar scrape that matched the grain of the building. She stepped inside, shook the mist from her jacket, and hung it on the hook by the door. The room smelled faintly of fabric and iron and yesterday's work. She did not turn on the overhead lights right away. She set down her bag, opened the window an inch to let the air move through. The sound of the harbor came in softly. A gull called, far enough away to sound almost like it was part of the wind. Across town, Caleb Rowan was already awake. He had been up since before the light shifted. The kettle sat empty on the stove now, drying on its own. He stood by the window of his cottage with a mug in both hands, looking past the glass rather than through it. The ocean was there, as it always was, stretching out without emphasis. He did not turn on the radio. The day did not ask him to hurry. By the time Iris walked toward the dock, the town had begun its slow movement. A shop owner lifted the metal grate halfway, not all the way, as if to test the air before committing. Someone swept the sidewalk outside a bait and tackle store, pushing last night's leaves into a pile that would scatter again by afternoon. The dock was already awake in its own way. Ropes creaked. A fishing boat idled, engine low, almost polite. Nets hung to dry, stiff with salt, catching the light in dull threads. The water moved against the pilings with a rhythm that never changed enough to notice until it did. Iris crossed the dock without stopping. She carried a small notebook, folded once and tucked under her arm. No headphones, no phone in her hand. She walked the way people did here, with their attention spread outward. Caleb appeared at the edge of the dock a few minutes later. He did not approach her. He leaned against the railing, one boot crossed over the other, watching the water instead. From a distance, it could have looked like coincidence. 2. People sharing the same space for no particular reason. A man unloading crates glanced up, then back down. He did not comment. In towns like this, noticing was a private act. Fog lifted and settled again, moving in layers rather than lifting all at once. It softened the edges of the boats, the buildings, even the people. Sound traveled differently in it. Voices came muted, then clear, then gone. Iris sat on a low bench near the end of the dock and opened her notebook. She did not write right away. She rested the pencil across the page and looked at the water, her foot rocking once against the wood. Behind her, Caleb adjusted his coat against the wind. He stayed where he was. There was no signal exchanged. No acknowledgement meant to mean anything. The distance between them held steady. By mid-morning, the town had found its shape. The coffee shop filled slowly, not with a rush, but with familiarity. Orders were spoken without menus. The bell over the door rang and rang again, each time expected. Iris returned to her workshop with a bag of rolls tucked under her arm. She placed one on the counter without looking at it and went back to the table. Fabric lay where she had left it, the seam from a night before held. She traced it once with her finger, then moved on. Outside, the wind picked up just enough to rattle the loose sign above the shop next door. Someone tightened it with a wrench. The sound echoed down the street and faded. Caleb walked past an hour later. He did not stop. He did not look in. He passed the window at a pace that matched the day, hands at his sides, shoulders relaxed. A child on a bicycle glanced at him, then turned back to the road. The light shifted again, thinning toward afternoon. Clouds moved in without promise of rain, but the air grew heavier, damp in the way the coast carried it. A fine mist settled on everything, leaving no drops, only a sheen. Someone standing on the far end of the street noticed the workshop window, still uncovered, the shape of Iris inside, moving steadily. Someone else noticed that the man from the cottage by the bend always walked past at roughly the same time. No one spoke about it. That was how this place worked. Things happened in plain sight. They were not announced. They were allowed. And if you stayed long enough, if you let your attention rest where it wanted to, you might begin to notice the small continuities. The way the town held its people. The way some light stayed on longer than expected. The way certain figures passed through the same spaces again and again, without drawing a line around themselves. Not everyone noticed, but someone always did. Caleb Rowan woke before the light settled into the room. Not before dawn exactly, But before the day made any promises, the sky outside his bedroom window held the same muted tone it always did at that hour, a gray that leaned toward blue, then paused there. The ocean was already moving. It never waited for anyone. He sat up without checking time. The floor was cold under his feet. He crossed the small room and opened the window an inch. Salt air slipped in immediately, damp and steady, carrying the low sound of water folding into itself. No waves breaking, no drama, just the long, even breath of the coast. He stood there for a moment longer than necessary, listening. The kettle went on next. No ruse. He filled it from the sink, set it on the stove, and waited. While it heated, he took the coffee from the cabinet. Whole beans, kept in a plain glass jar. He measured them by habit, not scale, and ground them slowly, the sound filling the quiet kitchen without interrupting it. French press. He poured the water when it reached the right temperature, stirred once, then set the lid on top and stepped away. He did not watch the clock. When the coffee was ready, he poured it into a single mug and carried it to the chair by the window. The chair faced the water whether he sat in it or not. He sat anyway. He drank slowly. The first fishing boat passed just offshore, heading out before the rest. Its engine hummed low. A gull followed it for a while, then veered away. The horizon stayed flat and wide. After the coffee, he opened a notebook he kept on the small table beside the chair. The pages were thick, slightly rough. He wrote a few lines, not sentences meant for anyone else. Marks, measurements, a note about a hinge he needed to fix later, a sketch of something unfinished that might never be finished at all. He closed the notebook when the page felt full enough. By the time he stepped outside, the light had shifted again. Still gray, still cool. The air clung to his coat. He locked the door behind him, not looking back, and walked toward the water. The path along the coast was uneven, worn into the land rather than laid over it. He followed it without adjusting his pace. The ground dipped where rain collected. He stepped around it, boots sinking slightly into damp earth. Farther down, a small group of harbor seals rested on a low stretch of rock near the shoreline. They barely reacted when he approached. One lifted its head, then settled again. Caleb stopped a short distance away and sat on a driftwood log, hands resting loosely on his knees. He stayed there. The seals shifted, bodies pressed close together, slick and still. The ocean moved around them without insisting they move with it. Caleb watched the water come in and out, tracing the same pattern over and over, until it stopped feeling like time passing at all. When he stood again, the cold had worked its way through his coat. He welcomed it. Back in town, the morning had reached its next phase. The dock was busy now. Men moved crates from one place to another. Someone called out a wait. Someone else laughed once, then went quiet again. Caleb paused near the edge of the dock and watched the boats come in. He did not offer help unless asked. He did not insert himself into conversations. He stood where he could see and be seen without being in the way. At the far end, a man struggled with a loose line. It tangled around a cleat and refused to cooperate. Caleb stepped closer, crouched, and worked the knot free with his hands. He handed the line back without comment and moved on before thanks could become a conversation. He walked past the grocery store next. Inside, the aisles were narrow. He picked up bread, soup, a handful of apples. The cashier nodded once when she rang him up. He nodded back. No words needed. From there, he went to the library. The building was small, the kind that carried the smell of old paper and polish no matter how often was cleaned. He returned a book and picked up another from the shelf without checking the cover too closely. He chose it by weight, by how it fit his hand. He sat at one of the tables near the window and read until the light outside changed again. Later, at home, he fixed the hinge he had noted that morning. The door stopped sticking. He mended a tear in his coat, stitching it carefully, evenly, leaving the repair visible but clean. He hung it back on the hook by the door. That evening, he ate at the same small place near the harbor. Soup, bread. He sat at the counter, not the tables, and listened to the quiet hum of the room. A couple talked softly behind him. Someone at the far end of the bar cleared his throat and did not say anything after. When he left, the fog had returned. It wrapped the street in soft edges, dimming the lights, carrying sound away before it could settle. Caleb walked through it without adjusting his pace. He knew the turns by memory. On Sunday, he went to the church. He arrived after the service had begun and slipped into the back pew. The wood creaked slightly under his weight. He sat with his hands folded loosely, not clasped, and looked toward the front without focusing on it. Light filtered through the windows in narrow bands. Dust moved in it. The room smelled of old wood and something faintly sweet. He did not bow his head. He did not speak. He sat until the room felt settled, then left the way he came, unnoticed by most, not trying to be. That night, he closed the window when the wind picked up. The latch clicked into place. The sound was final but not loud. Outside, the ocean kept moving. And inside, Caleb Rowan prepared for another morning that would arrive the same way, whether he watched it or not. She did not arrive as someone new. Iris Calder had already been part of the town long before Caleb noticed her as a person rather than a presence. People here knew her by routine, not by introduction. She was the woman who unlocked the workshop early, the one who bought thread in small amounts, the one who fixed hems quietly and never rushed a customer out the door. When Caleb first saw her clearly, it was not inside the workshop. It was outside the grocery store, late morning, the fog thinning just enough to show shapes without detail. Iris stood near the bike rack, tying down a bundle of fabric with practiced hands. The wind tugged at the loose edge. She adjusted once, twice, then stopped. It would hold. Caleb waited a few steps away, a paper bag in one hand, apples pressing lightly against the bottom. He did not move until she finished. She did not hurry because someone was nearby. When she stepped back, she noticed him in the same way she noticed most things. Without surprise, without pause, she gave a small nod. Not a greeting meant to start anything, just acknowledgement. He nodded back. That was all. They crossed paths again at the dock later that week. Iris sat on the edge with her feet dangling above the water, notebook open on her lap. She was not sketching the boats. She was writing measurements, numbers spaced evenly down the page. The tide came in and out beneath her boots. Caleb stood a short distance away, hands resting on the rail. He did not look at her notebook. She did not look at his watch. The harbor filled the space between them. Someone unloading supplies glanced at them both, then returned to his work. Two people sharing the same quiet did not register as unusual here. Another morning, she appeared at the library. She chose a table near the window, spreading out folded fabric samples, each one marked with chalk lines. The librarian passed by and said her name softly, not as a greeting, but as confirmation. Iris smiled once and went back to her work. Caleb sat at the far end of the room, book open, eyes moving steadily across the page. He turned one page, then another. When Iris stood to return a book, she paused near his table. Not because she wanted something, because that was where the aisle narrowed. She waited until he finished turning the page before passing. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he answered. Nothing followed. It was enough. Over time, their routines overlapped without effort. At the coffee shop, Iris took her cup black and carried it to the small table by the window. Caleb stood at the counter until his was ready, then took it outside. Sometimes she was already there. Sometimes she was not. When she was, he took the chair across from her without asking. He did not pull it closer. He did not fill the space with talk. She did not feel the need to explain her sketches. She did not ask him where he was from or how long he planned to stay. She did not ask what he did before this place or what he intended to do next. The safety came from what was missing. No proving, no offering, no quiet performance meant to impress. Once while walking along the coastal path, Iris slowed when the wind picked up sharply. The fog thickened without warning. She stopped and pulled her jacket tighter, looking ahead to where the path curved out of sight. Caleb stopped beside her, not close enough to crowd. "Visibility drops fast here," he said. She nodded. "It lifts just as fast." They waited. When the fog thinned again, they continued walking, not side by side, but near enough to register each other's presence. The seals were there again that day, resting on the rocks. Iris sat without comment. Caleb sat too. No one claimed the moment. Later, in town, someone mentioned Iris by name while Caleb was nearby. "She does good work," the man said, not to Caleb, just into the air. Caleb did not respond. He noticed that Iris did not either. Their conversation stayed small. Practical. The weather. The tide. The way the light shifted earlier now that winter was closer. Once, Iris mentioned she would be working late. Caleb said nothing more than, "It gets cold after dark." She nodded. "I have a heater." Neither of them changed their plans. In the evenings, sometimes they ended up at the same bar near the harbor. Not together. Just there. Iris ordered soup instead of a drink. Caleb sat at the far end, hands wrapped around a glass he did not finish quickly. They left at different times, but not hurriedly. If someone had asked Iris who Caleb Rowan was to her, she would not have had an answer that fit neatly. He was not a project, not a mystery, not a question waiting to be solved. He was someone who stayed within his own lines. And if you have ever worked late in a quiet town, or walked the same road at the same hour often enough to recognize footsteps without turning around, you might understand how that kind of presence feels. It does not ask for anything. It simply does not leave. The first real contact did not happen between them. It happened through someone else. Late afternoon settled over the town with the same muted patience as always. The fog had lifted just enough to leave the air damp, the kind that clung to jackets and hair without ever turning into rain. Iris closed the door of her workshop and turned the sign to "back soon," then headed toward the hardware and repair shop 2 blocks down. She carried a folded jacket under her arm. Inside the shop, the bell rang once. The space smelled of oil, wood, and old paper receipts. Shelves leaned slightly with age. A radio played low behind the counter, more habit than sound. Caleb stood near the back, examining a tray of brass screws. He had already been there a while. The owner, an older man with thick glasses, had stepped away to answer the phone. Iris stopped just inside the door when she saw Caleb. Not startled, just registering. She waited until he turned slightly, then spoke. "Excuse me." He stepped aside without comment, giving her space to reach the counter. She placed the jacket down carefully, smoothing the sleeve once. The shop owner returned and picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "Seam came loose," Iris said, "along the shoulder." The man nodded. "You want it reinforced or just closed?" "Reinforced," she said. "It carries weight there." Caleb glanced at the jacket then. It was familiar. The tear was small, clean, the kind that happened over time. The owner looked at him. "That yours?" Caleb nodded once. Iris did not look at him. "I can fix it by tomorrow," the owner said. "That works," Caleb said. The exchange ended there. The owner carried the jacket toward the back room. The radio crackled. The bell over the door rang again as someone passed by outside, not coming in. There was a pause. Not an awkward one, just a gap without instructions. "I did not charge for the stitching," the owner said, half turning back. Since she pointed it out, Iris shook her head. "It is fine. Put on my tab." Caleb looked at her then. "You do not have to," he said. She met his eyes briefly. "I know. That was it." The owner disappeared again, leaving them alone in the narrow aisle between shelves. Caleb shifted his weight once, then stopped. "Thank you," he said. "You would have noticed eventually," Iris replied. He did not argue. They walked out of the shop at the same time. Outside, the light had thinned toward evening. The road curved toward the water, wet and darkened by mist. Somewhere down the block, a door closed. A gull cried once, then went quiet. They stood for a moment near the steps. "I'm heading toward the dock," Iris said. "So am I," Caleb answered. They did not coordinate pace. They walked. The dock was quieter now. Most of the boats were in. Nets hung still. The water moved evenly, barely catching the last of the light. They stopped near the railing, a few feet apart. Iris rested her hands on the wood, feeling the grain under her palms. "Wind is changing," she said. "Yes," Caleb replied. Neither elaborated. After a minute, she spoke again. "They usually bring the fog back around dusk." He nodded. "It does not last long." They watched the water until the first layer of mist rolled in, softening the horizon. "I should get back," Iris said. "Of course." She turned, then paused. "If the shoulder gives again," she said, "bring it by earlier. That fabric responds better before it stretches." I will, Caleb said. She left without waiting for a response. Caleb stayed at the railing a while longer. If you have ever spoken to someone without needing to explain yourself, without needing to add more than was required, you know the kind of contact it was. Nothing exchanged that could not be taken back. Nothing taken that had not been offered. Just enough to continue walking through the same town without adjusting your steps. The first shift began without announcement. No sign was posted. No favor was asked. No agreement was made. Caleb Rowan arrived at the dock just after the fog thinned enough for the boats to appear again, their outlines returning one by one like they had never left. The morning had the same cold dampness it always carried, salt settling into wool and canvas without permission. A crate sat crooked near the edge of the pier. Someone had dragged it there and not finished the job. The rope beside it was half coiled, half abandoned. Caleb stopped, looked at it, then bent down. He did not roll up his sleeves. He did not look around to see who was watching. He lifted the crate, adjusted it closer to the stack, and set it down so the bottom sat flat. He picked up the rope and finished the coil cleanly, hand over hand, until it lay tight and orderly. That was all. He moved on. A fisherman glanced over from where he was sorting nets. He watched Caleb for a moment, then went back to his work. Nothing was said. Later, at the back of the diner, a delivery had arrived early. Boxes crowded the narrow space near the door, blocking the path. The cook stepped around them, muttering under his breath. Caleb picked up the nearest box and moved it inside. Then the next. He stacked them where they belonged and stepped out of the way again before anyone had time to respond. Thanks, the cook said, already turning back to the stove. Caleb nodded once and left. By mid-morning, the town had noticed. Not loudly. Not all at once. Just enough. People noticed that the man who did not need to be anywhere was sometimes exactly where a small task had been left unfinished. That things were lighter by the time someone else reached them. That a hinge stopped squeaking. That a step felt steadier underfoot. No one called him out for it. No one asked questions. The reaction was not gratitude. It was adjustment. The town did not rearrange itself around him. It simply absorbed the work and continued. At the workshop, Iris Calder was already deep in her day. Fabric lay across the table, chalk lines faint but precise. She worked with the window cracked open, letting the sound of the harbor bleed in. The heater clicked on and off behind her, barely keeping up. She did not know about the crate, or the boxes, or the hinge at the post office door that no longer caught when it closed. She knew that the light shifted earlier now, that her hands tired faster in the cold, that one sleeve on the piece in front of her still pulled wrong no matter how many times she adjusted it. When she stepped outside for air, she saw Caleb across the street, kneeling beside the old bench near the bus stop. One of the slats had split down the middle. He was fitting a thin brace beneath it, holding it in place with one hand while tightening a screw with the other. The work was slow, careful. Iris watched for a moment. She did not cross the street. She did not call out. She went back inside. The bench held. Someone sat on it later without knowing it had almost given way that morning. That afternoon, Iris went to the grocery store. She carried her basket with one arm, the other free. At the end of the produce aisle, she saw Caleb again, lifting a case of bottled water onto a lower shelf that had sagged slightly. The store owner stood nearby, arms crossed. "You do not have to do that," the owner said. Caleb slid the case into place and stepped back. "It sits better this way," he replied. The owner studied the shelf, then nodded once. "All right." No discount was offered. No joke was made. Iris passed them without stopping. She reached for apples. She chose the smaller ones, firm, with fewer marks. At the register, the owner rang her up and mentioned the weather. She responded. The receipt printed. Outside, the wind picked up again, pushing fog back toward the street. Iris pulled her jacket tighter and headed toward the workshop. She did not look back. By evening, the small bar near the harbor filled with its usual crowd. Nothing special, just people who knew where to sit. Caleb took a stool near the end. He ordered soup. He ate slowly. When a chair leg wobbled at the next table, he stood, crouched, and tightened the bolt beneath it. The couple sitting there barely noticed until the chair stopped moving. "Better," one of them asked. "Yes," Caleb said. He returned to his seat. Across the room, Iris sat with her back to the wall, a bowl of soup untouched in front of her. She had come in cold and tired, looking for heat more than company. She noticed the chair only because the room had gone quiet around it for a moment. She looked at Caleb. He did not look back. Her reaction was not what the town might have expected. She did not soften. She did not approach. She did not smile in recognition or offer thanks on behalf of anyone else. When he passed her table on his way out, she spoke without turning. You will strain your wrist if you keep using that screwdriver with your hand angled like that. He stopped, turned slightly. She continued, still not looking at him. The handle is worn. It slips. Use the one with a wider grip. He nodded. All right. That was it. No pras. No curiosity. No attempt to define what he was doing. He left. The town settled into night. Fog rolled in fully this time, thick enough to dampen sound. Lights blurred. Footsteps softened. At the dock, someone tripped over a rope that should not have been there. It was not. At the workshop, Iris worked late again. The heater clicked. The fabric warmed under her hands. Outside, the bench at the bus stop held steady under the weight of a man, waiting for a ride that would be late. No one spoke of the man who had fixed it. The twist was not that Caleb worked. It was that nothing changed because of it. No one praised him. No one questioned him. No one elevated him for doing what did not need to be done. The town did not turn him into a story, and Iris did not turn him into something else. She adjusted her work, corrected a seam, started again where it pulled wrong. Across the street, a light came on and stayed on longer than expected. And in the quiet that followed, if you have ever done something simply because it was there to be done, without needing it to mean more than that, you might understand why the first shift mattered. Not because it solved anything, but because it did not. The tension did not announce itself. It arrived the way fog did here, quietly, settling into the spaces that had once felt open. Nothing had changed on the surface. The town moved the same way. The water kept its rhythm. The lights still came on and went off when they always had. But the distance between things began to matter. Caleb noticed it first in the way Iris looked past him. Not away, past. At the coffee shop one morning, she stood at the counter waiting for her cup. Caleb stood a few feet behind her. When the barista set the mug down, Iris reached for it, thanked her, and turned slightly to the side to make room. Her eyes crossed Caleb's for less than a second, then moved on. It was not avoidance. It was precision. Caleb stepped forward and placed his order. The sound of the grinder filled the space between them. Steam rose. Someone laughed near the door and then stopped. Iris took her cup to the window table and sat down. She did not open her notebook right away. She watched the street. The fog thinned enough to show the curve of the road, then thickened again. Caleb took his coffee outside. The space where he might have sat remained empty. Later that day, at the dock, they stood on opposite sides of the same railing. The tide was coming in. The water carried small pieces of driftwood toward shore, tapping them lightly against the pilings. A seal surfaced, then disappeared again without sound. Iris leaned forward, hands on the rail, shoulders squared. Caleb stood back, weight evenly distributed, eyes following the line where water met land. Neither spoke. The quiet stretched, not uncomfortably, but with weight. If you have ever shared a silence that held more than words would have, you know the kind. Iris shifted first. She stepped away from the rail and adjusted the strap of her bag. Her movements were efficient, measured. She glanced toward the path leading back into town, then hesitated just long enough to be noticed. Caleb did not move. She turned and walked away. That evening, Iris worked later than usual. The heater ran longer, clicking on and off with a faint protest. Her hands moved steadily, but the fabric resisted more than it had before. A sleeve pulled. A seam refused to lie flat. She undid the stitches and started again. Outside, the wind pressed against the building harder than it had earlier. She stood and closed the window, latching it firmly. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. Across town, Caleb sat at his small table with the notebook open in front of him. He had written nothing for several minutes. The pen rested between his fingers. The page stayed blank. He closed the notebook and set it aside. The next day, they crossed paths at the grocery store. Iris stood near the bread shelf, comparing two loaves that looked nearly identical. Caleb approached from the other end of the aisle and stopped when he saw her there. He waited. She chose one loaf and placed it in her basket. She turned. This time their eyes met fully. Neither smiled. Neither looked away immediately. It was not confrontation. It was recognition of something unspoken that now occupied the space between them. "Morning," Caleb said. "Morning," Iris replied. The exchange held, then released. She passed him without slowing. Caleb picked up the loaf she had put back and examined it briefly before returning it to the shelf. He chose another. That night, fog rolled in thick and low, swallowing the streetlights whole. Sound dulled. The world narrowed. At the bar near the harbor, Iris sat alone, a bowl of soup cooling in front of her. She stared into it without eating, the surface reflecting the dim light above. Caleb entered quietly and took his usual seat near the end. They did not look at each other. The room filled with small noises. A spoon against ceramic. A chair scraping lightly against the floor. Someone coughing once and apologizing to no one in particular. Iris lifted her spoon and took a bite. Then another. Caleb finished his soup and stood. As he passed her table, he slowed, not enough to stop, but enough to register. "You fixed the bench well," she said, still looking at her bowl. He paused. "It needed it," he replied. She nodded once. That was all. He left. The door closed behind him with a soft thud. Iris sat there a moment longer, then stood and put her bowl on the counter. She pulled her jacket on and stepped outside into the fog. The air was thick and cool, pressing against her face. She took a breath and let it out slowly, watching it disappear almost immediately. If you're listening now, this might be a good place to pause with her. Not to think, just to breathe once. In, out. The fog did not lift right away. It rarely did when you wanted it to. At the edge of town, Caleb stood near the water, hands in his coat pockets, looking toward where the horizon should have been. The ocean moved unseen, its sound closer now that sight had receded. He stayed there longer than necessary. Across the way, Iris walked the long route home, the one that curved with the coast instead of cutting through town. Her footsteps fell into a rhythm that matched the water. Neither of them reached for what was forming between them. They did not name it. They allowed it to exist, suspended, held in the space of glances not followed by steps, of words left exactly where they were spoken. And in a town that understood distance as well as it understood closeness, that was enough to keep things moving. Slowly, quietly, without forcing the tide. The shift did not move forward all at once. It edged. The town woke under a thin layer of drizzle that morning, the kind that never decided to become rain. Its softened sound darkened the wood along the harbor and made the road shine without reflection. The ocean stayed low and steady, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple where something moved beneath. Iris Calder stepped out of her workshop just after 8. She locked the door and checked the sign, then turned toward the coastal path instead of heading straight into town. She had chosen the longer way on purpose. Halfway down the path, she heard footsteps behind her. Measured, even, not rushed. She did not turn immediately. Caleb Rowan slowed when he saw her ahead. He did not close the distance. He kept his pace, allowing the space between them to remain intact. They walked that way for several minutes, close enough to know the other was there, far enough to keep the air clear. At a bend where the path narrowed, Iris stepped aside to let him pass. He stopped instead. "You go first," he said. She shook her head slightly. "It is easier if you do." He stepped ahead. The moment passed without friction. Farther on, the path widened again, opening to a view of the water. Fog lifted in streaks, revealing the line of the horizon in pieces. A seal surfaced near the rocks, then disappeared. Caleb stopped and leaned against the railing. Iris continued a few steps, then paused. She turned back. "You usually stop here," she said. He nodded. "Yes." She hesitated, then joined him at the railing, leaving a careful distance between them. They stood there without speaking, watching the water move. The drizzle cooled their jackets. The wind pressed lightly against their backs. After a while, Iris broke the silence. "I am heading into town after this," she said. I need to pick up a zipper. All right, Caleb replied. Another pause. You can walk with me if you want, she added. Or not. He did not answer right away. He looked toward the road, then back at the water. I will walk part of the way, he said. They turned together. For the first time, their steps fell into the same rhythm. They did not speak as they walked. The sound of their boots on damp ground matched. A truck passed on the road below, tires hissing, then faded into fog. At the edge of town, where the path split, Iris slowed. I turn here, she said. Caleb stopped. So do I, he replied. They walked the next block together. At the hardware and repair shop, Iris paused again. I need to go in, she said. I will wait outside, Caleb offered. She shook her head. You do not have to. I know, he said. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Then wait, she said. He did. She went inside. The bell rang once. Through the window, Caleb watched her speak with the owner, hands moving as she described something small and precise. She pointed once, listened, nodded. She came back out a few minutes later with the zipper in a paper sleeve. Thank you for waiting, she said. He nodded. Of course. They stood there without moving. The town moved around them. Someone laughed across the street. A door closed. The drizzle lightened. I will walk from here, Iris said. Caleb did not step forward. All right, he replied. She took one step, then stopped. This is enough for now, she said, not unkindly. He met her eyes. Yes. She turned and walked away, her pace steady, not quickened. Caleb stayed where he was until she disappeared into the workshop. He did not follow. He did not leave immediately either. If you're listening and wondering what comes next, this is where the story asks you to wait with them. Not to decide, not to rush. You do not have to answer yet. Sometimes the smallest trust is not in moving closer, but in knowing exactly where to stop. Movement returned in small ways. Not the kind that announced itself, and not the kind that asked to be followed. Just enough to shift the air. The morning the ferry schedule changed, the dock grew crowded earlier than usual. A weather delay farther north pushed boats into town at the same time, compressing routines that usually spread themselves out. Engines idled longer. Ropes crossed where they normally did not. Caleb Rowan arrived as he always did, coat zipped, hands free. Near the edge of the pier, an older man struggled with a cart loaded unevenly, one wheel catching on a warped board. The cart tipped just enough to make the crate slide. Caleb stepped forward and caught the nearest one before it fell into the water. He did not grab the cart. He steadied the crate, set it back, then stepped away. The man righted the cart himself. He nodded once, not looking up. Appreciate it, he said, already moving on. Caleb did not reply. From the far end of the dock, Iris Calder saw the motion out of the corner of her eye. She had come down to pick up a delivery of canvas that morning, the kind that absorbed moisture if left too long. She watched the crate settle back into place. She watched Caleb step back into his space. Nothing else followed. No instruction, no habiting, no outcome to manage. She turned back to her work. Later that day, the weather shifted again. The drizzle turned into a brief, heavier rain that swept through town and left just as quickly. The road darkened. Leaves stuck to boots. The wind pushed harder, then eased. At the bus stop near the bend, a woman stood with her hood pulled low, one hand gripping a paper bag that was already softening from the rain. She adjusted her footing as a bus approached too fast, splashing water across the curb. The bag slipped from her hand. Caleb, standing a few steps away, picked it up before it hit the ground. He held it out. She took it back, fingers brushing the paper briefly. Thanks, she said. He nodded. The bus doors opened. She boarded. The bus pulled away. Caleb stayed where he was. Across the street, Iris paused mid-step. She had seen the exchange. Not clearly, just enough to register the shape of it. She did not cross over. She continued toward the workshop. That evening, the power flickered. Not a full outage, just enough to dim the lights and make the heater pause mid-cycle. The workshop fell into a hush, machines quiet, the only sound the wind pressing against the building. Iris stood at her table and waited. The power returned after a few seconds. The lights steadied. The heater clicked back on. She went back to work. Across town at the small library, A stack of returns slid off the edge of a cart when someone bumped into it too quickly. Books scattered across the floor. Caleb knelt and gathered them without comment, stacking them back where they belonged. The librarian thanked him quietly. He nodded and returned to his seat. Nothing else happened. On the coastal path the next morning, a section of fence leaned farther than it should have, loosened by rain and wind. A child leaned against it and laughed, not noticing the way it shifted. Caleb slowed as he passed. He tested the post with his hand. It moved. He did not call out. He came back later with a small tool kit, tightened the bolts, and left the fence as he had found it, except steadier. No one noticed the repair, but no one leaned through it again either. The town absorbed the movement and went on. The second satellite arrived quietly. It came not through action, but through absence. At the bar near the harbor, Iris sat with her soup untouched again, steam rising and thinning as she stared at the surface. She had stayed later than intended. The day had stretched. Her hands ached. Caleb entered and took his usual seat. The room filled, then thinned. Someone turned on the radio for a song, then turned it off halfway through. Iris lifted her spoon, then set it down again. Caleb noticed. He did not ask. He finished his soup, stood, and placed a few bills on the counter. As he passed Iris's table, he slowed just enough to be seen. "The fog is coming back strong," he said. She looked up. "Yes," she replied. He waited. "If you want," he added, "the long way stays clearer." She considered this. "Thank you," she said. "I know." He nodded and left. Iris stayed seated for another minute, then stood and put on her jacket. She stepped outside into the thickening air. She chose the long way. They did not walk together that night. They did not meet at the path. But the distance between their choices narrowed just slightly. If you are listening for a turning point, this is not it. There was no rescue that needed to happen. No moment that required a decision. Only small courtesies that arrived and left without ceremony. In towns like this, those were easy to miss. But they mattered in the way steady ground mattered when the fog came in. Nothing had changed. And yet, the path felt a little clearer underfoot. Just enough to keep walking. The consequence arrived quietly, the way most things did here. It came wrapped in a detail small enough to be repeated without intention. On a gray afternoon, Iris Calder stood at the counter of the hardware and repair shop, waiting for change. The bell over the door had just rung behind her. She heard boots on the floor, then the pause that meant someone had stopped to look for something. The owner slid the coins across the counter. "Your friend was in earlier," he said. Iris looked up. "My friend." The owner nodded toward the back room. "The man with the coat. The one who fixed the bench." Iris did not respond right away. "He asked if the zipper came in yet," the owner added. "Said he might come back later." Iris gathered the coins and slipped them into her pocket. "He did not need to ask," she said. The owner shrugged. "Just thought I would tell you." She nodded once and stepped outside. The air had turned colder again. The wind pressed in off the water, carrying the smell of salt and wet wood. Iris pulled her jacket tighter and stood for a moment on the step, not moving. "Friend." The word stayed with her longer than the owner had. Later that evening, she saw Caleb near the dock. He stood where he usually did, hands resting on the railing, looking out toward the water. The light was thinning. Fog moved in low layers, softening the edge of the pier. Iris approached and stopped a few feet away. "You were at the shop," she said. "Yes," Caleb replied. She waited. "They mentioned you asked about the zipper," she continued. He nodded. "I did." "You did not need to," she said. He turned slightly toward her. "I know." The space between them held. She did not accuse. He did not explain. After a moment, Iris spoke again. "They called you my friend?" Caleb did not react immediately. "Did they?" he said. "Yes." Another pause. "That is not something I said," he replied. "I know," Iris said. They stood there, the water moving steadily below them. A gull cried somewhere farther out, then went quiet. The misinterpretation did not grow louder. It did not spread, but it settled. The next day, Iris worked with the door closed. Not locked, just closed. The sign remained turned to open, but the glass reflected more than it revealed. Inside, the heater ran longer than usual. The sound filled the space between stitches. Caleb passed the workshop that afternoon and noticed the door. He did not stop. He walked on. At the grocery store, the owner greeted Iris by name and asked if she wanted the usual. She nodded. When Caleb entered a few minutes later, the owner mentioned the weather and nothing else. At the bar that evening, Iris chose a table farther from the door. Caleb took his usual stool. They were not avoiding each other. They were adjusting. When Caleb stood to leave, he passed her table without slowing. Iris watched the door close behind him, then returned to her soup. The consequence showed itself again 2 days later. A delivery truck arrived late, blocking part of the street near the workshop. The driver struggled to maneuver the pallet jack over uneven pavement. Caleb approached and placed a board beneath the wheel, leveling it just enough for the jack to roll. The driver nodded and continued. From inside the workshop, Iris saw the motion through the window. She did not step outside. She finished the seam she was working on and pressed it flat, the iron hissing softly. That night, the fog came in thick and early. Iris chose the short way home. At the bend where the path narrowed, she saw Caleb ahead, stopping when he noticed her behind him. He stepped aside, offering space. She passed without comment. Neither of them turned. If someone had asked what had changed, neither would have had an answer that fit cleanly. Nothing had been said that needed to be taken back. Nothing had been done that required repair. But the wrong detail had been repeated once, and that was enough to shift the weight of things. The town continued as it always did. The bench held. The fence stayed steady. The fog lifted and returned. And between them, something adjusted its shape, not breaking, not resolving, simply finding a new line to hold. Not farther apart, not closer, just different. And for now, that difference was allowed to remain. The realization did not arrive as a thought. It came as a pattern. Caleb Rowan noticed it first in the way people no longer paused when he entered a space. The grocery store door opened and closed around him without interruption. The bar stool he favored was no longer considered his. Someone sat there once. He took another without comment. The town did not wait for him, and he did not expect it to. One morning, near the dock, a rope snapped back against the wood with a sharp sound. A fisherman swore quietly and reached for another length without looking up. Caleb stood close enough to help, far enough not to interfere. He stayed where he was. The man managed it himself. Caleb realized then that his presence no longer registered as something separate, not as help, not as distance, just as part of the background that held steady. He walked the length of the pier and stopped at the end, where the boards grew darker from constant spray. He looked down at the water and then back toward town. Nothing pulled at him. Nothing pushed. The next few days unfolded with the same unremarkable consistency. At the library, a chair scraped loudly as someone stood too fast. Caleb adjusted it when the room emptied. No one noticed. No one needed to. At the church on Sunday, he took his place on the back pew as always. The service moved around him. Words rose and fell. Light filtered through the tall windows and settled on the worn wood. He did not bow his head. He did not leave early. He sat until the room emptied and the silence returned, deeper for having been interrupted. When he stood to go, he noticed Iris near the side aisle, lighting a candle and stepping back. She did not look toward him. She finished what she came to do and left through the side door. Caleb stayed seated. The realization sharpened later that afternoon. A storm had passed offshore, leaving behind a restless wind. Waves pushed harder against the rocks. The path along the coast was slick, uneven in places where rainwater had collected. Caleb walked it anyway. Near the bend, he saw Iris ahead, moving carefully, her pace steady but slower than usual. She carried a bundle of fabric under her arm, wrapped tight against the damp. She did not turn. When she heard his footsteps, he slowed. They walked the same direction for a time without speaking. At a narrow stretch where the path dipped, Iris paused. "It is slippery here," she said. "I know," Caleb replied. She stepped aside to let him pass first. He shook his head. "After you." She considered this, then nodded and went ahead. Caleb followed at a distance that did not suggest guarding or retreat. When they reached the open stretch near the water, Iris stopped and turned toward him. "I will head back from here," she said. "All right," he replied. She adjusted the bundle under her arm. "I saw you at the church," she added. "Yes," Caleb said. Another pause. She looked at him steadily, without curiosity, without demand. "You fit here," she said. It was not praise. It was not reassurance. It was observation. Caleb did not respond immediately. He looked past her toward the water, where foam broke and dissolved without pattern. "I'm not trying to," he said. She nodded. "I know." That was all. She turned and walked back the way she had come. Caleb stayed where he was, watching her until the path curved and she disappeared from view. The realization settled fully then. Not that he belonged, but that he no longer needed to measure himself against the idea of belonging at all. The town had not accepted him. It had stopped noticing him as something separate, and Iris had noticed that he noticed. In the days that followed, Caleb changed nothing. He still woke before the light settled. He still brewed coffee slowly. He still walked the coast and watched the water move without urgency. But the edges softened. He did not hesitate when someone asked for help. He did not insert himself when they did not. He no longer checked his own position in the quiet after doing something small. At the workshop, Iris worked with the door open again. Not as an invitation, just as it had always been. Caleb passed by one afternoon and heard the sound of fabric being cut, the steady rhythm of work. He did not stop. He did not look in. He continued down the street. That evening, they ended up at the bar at the same time. Iris sat near the window, her jacket draped over the back of the chair. Caleb took a seat at the counter. The radio played low, a song half remembered and easily forgotten. When Iris stood to leave, she paused near him. "I'm taking tomorrow off," she said. He looked at her. "All right. I will be back the day after," she added. "I will be here," he replied. She smiled slightly. Not at him, at the idea that nothing required explanation. She left. Caleb finished his drink and stayed a while longer. If you're listening and feel the quiet opening here, this is the moment to notice it. Not the words, the space around them. Sometimes, what changes is not the relationship between two people, but the way one person stops trying to be anything other than where they already are. Caleb did not claim a role in the town. He recognized that he had one, and Iris, without asking him to name it, respected the choice to let it remain unnamed. The tide came in. The tide went out. The town held its shape, and within it, something settled into place without needing to be said aloud. The morning returned the way it always did. Gray first, then a thin band of light settling along the water, not bright enough to promise anything, only enough to reveal what was already there. The ocean moved with the same patience. The houses held their weathered lines. The road curved and disappeared in a mist exactly where it always had. Caleb Rowan woke before the light reached the window. The routine was unchanged. The kettle, the coffee, the chair by the glass. But the order felt slightly different, as if one step had shifted forward and another back, without altering the whole. He opened the window and listened. The sound of the water was closer today. Or maybe he was. He drank his coffee more slowly than usual, letting it cool a little before finishing it. When he opened his notebook, he did not write right away. He turned a page first, then another. He stopped on a blank one and left it that way. Outside, the first boat passed without a gull following it. He walked the coastal path later, boots steady on damp ground. The fence he had tightened held. The rocks near the water were slick, but familiar. The seals were there again, resting in a loose cluster, barely lifting their heads when he sat nearby. He stayed, a while then stood. In town, the grocery store door opened and closed around him as it always had. He picked up bread, soup, apples. The cashier rang him up without looking up. He did not need the acknowledgement. At the library, he returned the book he had finished and chose another. This time, he took one from a shelf he had not reached for before. He did not linger over the decision. The church doors were open that afternoon, the interior dim and cool. He sat on the back pew again, hands resting loosely, eyes following the way light fell across the worn wood. When he left, he did not look back. Across town, Iris called her, unlocked her workshop, and turned the sign to open. The space looked the same. The table, the fabric, the heater clicking on and off with quiet persistence. But she moved differently through it. Not faster, just with fewer pauses. She cut fabric first, before checking her notes. She stitched before adjusting the lamp. The order had changed, but the work did not suffer for it. When she stepped outside for air, the fog had thinned enough to show the dock clearly. Boats moved in and out. Nets hung to dry. The bench at the bus stop held steady under the weight of a man waiting. She watched for a moment, then went back inside. Later, at the coffee shop, she took her usual cup and chose the table by the window. Caleb stood at the counter behind her, waiting his turn. When she turned with her mug, their eyes met briefly. Neither of them smiled. Neither looked away too quickly. She sat. He took his coffee outside. The space where he might have joined her remained empty, but it no longer felt unfinished. That evening, they crossed paths on the coastal road. Iris walked toward town, hands tucked into her jacket sleeves. Caleb walked in the opposite direction, the wind pressing against his coat. They slowed as they passed each other. "Evening," Iris said. "Evening," Caleb replied. They continued on. The town settled into night. Lights came on behind curtains. The bar filled and emptied. Fog rolled in and out without urgency. Somewhere, a door closed softly. At the dock, the water moved the same way it always had, tapping gently against the pilings. If you looked closely, you might have noticed how. The day arranged itself differently now. The same places, the same paths, but the sequence had shifted just enough to change the weight of things. Caleb stood at the edge of the pier longer than usual that night, hands resting on the rail, watching the water catch what little light remained. He did not wait for anything to happen. Iris worked later than planned, not because she had to, but because the work held. She finished a seam, pressed it flat, and left the rest for the morning. When she locked the door and turned the sign, she did not check the street. She already knew what it would look like. Maine stayed quiet. The ocean stayed steady. The town kept its rhythm. And within it, two lives returned to their routines, unchanged in shape, altered in meaning, moving forward not by milestones, but by order. The same places, a different way of passing through them. The town did not change to mark the ending. Morning arrived again with the same muted patience. The water moved. The docks held. The road curved and disappeared into fog where it always had. The houses faced the sea whether anyone looked out or not. Caleb Rowan stood at the edge of the pier as the light thinned, hands resting on the rail. A boat passed farther out, engine low, leaving a line that smoothed itself away almost immediately. He watched until the surface returned to its usual calm. He did not wait for anything to happen. Across town, Iris Calder closed her workshop door and turned the sign. The room behind the glass stayed warm a little longer, the heat settling into fabric and wood before fading. She paused on the step, listening to the harbor breathe, then walked home the long way, letting the path decide the pace. They did not meet that evening. They did not need to. The bench at the bus stop held steady. The fence along the path stayed firm. The church stood open and quiet, wood and light doing what they had always done. In the bar near the harbor, a stool was taken and freed and taken again without ceremony. The town kept its order. If someone were to notice closely, they might see how things now moved without friction, how small tasks were done and released, how space was given and accepted, how presence no longer asked to be defined. Caleb returned to his routines with a steadiness that did not require proof. Iris returned to her work with an order that made room for breath. The same places held them both, not as points to arrive at, but as ground that did not shift underfoot. This was not a story of arrival. It was a story of staying, of choosing to be where one already stood, of letting work be work, of allowing distance to mean respect, of discovering that care could exist without urgency, and that continuity could be its own quiet form of commitment. The town remained, rough on the outside, gentle within. It did not resolve anything for them. It did not ask them to resolve anything for it. It simply stayed. And if the light in the workshop came on again after dark, and if a figure paused outside without asking why, the town would hold that too, the way it held everything else. Nothing needed to be concluded. The path was still there in the morning. And if someone wished to remain a while longer, there was room to do so.